Welcome, Jan Colburn de Snohetta está con nosotros. It's an honor, Jan, having you in this place, Guadalajara City, the best city of Mexico. Gracias a todos por venir a este evento. De verdad es un honor para la Cámara Mexicana de la Industria de la Construcción estar en ConstruExpo 2012 presentando al arquitecto Jan Colburn de Snohetta, empresa noruega que su especialidad es el diseño de museos y paisajismo. El día de hoy yo quisiera pedirles a todos un favor. Todos los que se dedican al Face y al Twitter, si pueden por ahí mandar un mensaje en Twitter que nos apoyaran en este momento, es muy importante que nos ayuden a difundir la ConstruExpo 2012 para que más personas asistan y reconozcan que este es el mejor evento de la industria de la construcción, la mejor exposición de maquinaria bajo techo a nivel nacional y una de las mejores exposiciones en Latinoamérica. Sean todos bienvenidos. En proporción alarmante han desaparecido las publicaciones dedicadas a la arquitectura las palabras belleza, inspiración, embrujo, magia, sortilegio, encantamiento y también las de serenidad, silencio, intimidad y asombro. Todas ellas han encontrado amorosa acogida en mi alma y si estoy lejos de pretenderles hables hechos plena justicia en mi obra, no por eso han dejado de ser mi faro. Palabras de Luis Barragán. Hoy, la más grande expresión de diseño en arquitectura es un gozo al que todos tienen acceso y es un idioma universal. Arquitectos mexicanos diseñan en Arabia, Europa, Asia, y arquitectos noruegos, expertos en el diseño de museos y edificios sustentables, son parte de la imagen de la Guadalajara actual, ya que la expresión arquitectónica evoluciona de tal manera que es incluyente de toda ciudad, estado o país. Es un orgullo para los ciudadanos de esta gran urbe que en poco tiempo nuestra capital jalisciense contará con un museo de ciencias ambientales, diseñado con esquemas de sustentabilidad, armonía con la sociedad y la naturaleza, diseñado por la gran firma de arquitectura Snohetta. Diseñadores de grandes obras que se han convertido en íconos de grandes ciudades como la Opera House de Oslo, Noruega y Chicago, o museos temáticos en Londres, Arabia Saudita, Emiratos Árabes o Nueva York. Guadalajara pasará a ser parte de esa arquitectura moderna, que dará apertura para que los arquitectos locales conozcan y reconozcan la innovación de integrar la arquitectura al entorno, a la naturaleza, a la fortaleza local. La Cámara Mexicana de la Industria de la Construcción, consciente de la importancia del diseño arquitectónico, impulsa el vínculo con las empresas a través de nuevos e innovadores espacios para los expertos que se fortalecen en mesas de diálogo y de negocio. Se propone la innovación y la eficiencia en proyectos y en las empresas. Así los expertos de la CEMIC deberán ser quienes realicen con creatividad e imaginación los proyectos arquitectónicos para nuestra ciudad, que deberá afrontar el futuro con responsabilidad, con planeación, con integridad, convirtiendo a la Gran Guadalajara como el ícono de la modernidad de la ciudad que queremos construir. Únete a los expertos, sé parte de la Cámara Mexicana de la Industria de la Construcción. Sean todos ustedes bienvenidos. Welcome, Jan, to Guadalajara. Welcome to the most important exhibition of construction. Thank you for coming. Felicidades a todos y tengan un buen día.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to to return to Guadalajara. I was here in May and met a few of you. There's a few familiar faces out there. Thank you to CMIX for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be part of this industry, part of this great exhibition here in Guadalajara. A little advertisement with. We actually designed the bubble that the car was driving in. As you can see, the premise of it was that the air inside where the car was, it was actually better air than what was in the rest of the city. What it signifies for me when I thought about the question that was given to us to speak about green building and alternative energy is somewhat of an idea about lateral thinking. It's a little advertisement with. We actually designed the bubble that the car was driving in. As you can see, the premise of it was that the air inside where the car was, it was actually better air than what was in the rest of the city. What it signifies for me when I thought about the question that was given to us to speak about green building and alternative energy is somewhat of an idea about lateral thinking. It's the people were supposed to collect, but it was more at the city scale than it was at the human scale. Frank Lloyd Wright pushed it a little bit further and pushed the people further apart. He also introduced the idea of towers. He had an idea that there would be 5 acres per family and they would produce their own food. I mean, it's obvious this didn't work out because not all of us here want to produce our own food. It takes a lot of time and effort to do something like that. But he was searching for an ideal. He was even looking at transportation. What's interesting about this is that through time, we're reacting to what's happening to our cities at that time. Corbu in 1935 and Frank Lloyd Wright in 58. Right now in the world, people are moving to cities. The one thing that these two guys were right about is that eventually all of us will be interested in cohabitating in a city environment. The rural population is moving to the cities and thus our population in the cities is increasing quickly. We're right at the crossroads of that right now. In the next couple of years, it's going to tip the scales. Our cities will have more people than the rural areas. And this is important because we're at the point where we need to take care of ourselves. We need to create a sustainable environment for our people to be happy, to live in, to interact in. I love this drawing, as I call it, because at night we all go to sleep and we turn our lights on and we do this drawing together, all of us. There's 2% of the Earth's surface that is covered by 50% of the population, hence the people moving to cities. That population uses 75% of the Earth's resources, and we create those people create 80% of the emissions. It's not probably a way to continue forward to sustain our environment, to sustain our Earth. We've got to think about our cities. We've got to think about how we live in them, how we can use the energy that we're producing and reuse all of our resources. We recently did a proposal for a city. Maybe it's a utopian city, maybe it's an ideal city. Ultimately, the premise was that it needed to be sustainable. This was not because somebody was interested in pushing the latest, greatest solar panel or wind turbine or some technological engineered feat. It was because the city was located in the middle of the desert. So it was necessity that it needed to be self-sustaining, that we need to take into account everything that makes the city what it is. From the micro scale, we're looking at all of the sustainable building principles, from collection of water, to shading, to incorporating greenscape for people to be happy in the city of this place. You can't only look at the micro though, you have to look at the entire region. So this map shows us that we're taking into account the minimal amount of water and wetlands that surround the city. What can we do with those? How can we collect that water? How can we maintain it? It's the one resource that basically doesn't exist in the desert. We start to incorporate that into what we're calling an organizational schematic, maintaining every single bit of water that comes to our site, reusing it, reappropriating it, and ultimately making a better lifestyle for the people that'll be there. The second big point that we're having to research there is how do you make energy for an entire city? So fortunately in the desert there's a lot of sun. We use of massive solar farm here that is basically the same size as the city and a power hub that would continually regenerate energy for the city. Being in the desert, you have a lot of sun, so we need to study the best location for the city, and this is based on reducing the amount of energy you have to produce. So our shading studies started to guide us towards the ravines that were fortunately on the site. We began to locate our buildings and our cityscape within those ravines, which led us to understand that there was a little bit of wind that we could also harness, not only for cooling, but for energy production. So we're starting to make the crossover between the larger scape of the overall city into the building scape. Ultimately, we house the majority of the city within these ravines. There's this large, enormous roofscape that is the prominent feature for the city. It not only provides shading and the collection of water, but also solar to power the city. And then to the south, you can see some of the food production to support the city. I don't know if this is ideal. This will probably never be built. But we're taking into account every possible way of living so as we can provide the highest quality of environment for the people that are going to be there. Because as we said before, if there's people that come together, that's what makes the place. Another large project that we were looking into, that we're currently looking into, is Europa City. It's a new development city between Paris and Charles de Gaulle. Currently, it's a huge amount of farmland, and thinking about this place to displace those farmers and move them somewhere else is not possible. France has already farmed. Every piece of space is allocated for every single person. Everything is down to a T. So rather than move the farmers, we just lifted the farmers up. We peel up the ground a little bit and build a building that is full of commercial enterprise. Some of the materials are very direct for us. We're just using the earth to actually build the building, so it's all rammed earth. And then introducing at this scale courtyards that will bring both light and air into the buildings. And of course, when you have something of this size, you get to dream a little bit and have a little bit of fun. So maybe there's a ski resort inside. Could just be fun. Not all of the projects have to work at this scale. You can't forget about the human being. Le Corbusier did a little bit when he was working on his Radiant City in 1935, and his plazas were very unfriendly. All he really needed to do was put a bench in. We worked on a bench in Guatemala City. What's important about this bench is that it provides a place for the people to come to have a conversation. Just that act is what makes a city, bringing people together in a place where they can talk to one another. This is how the Greeks developed their cities and the reason for it. So the design of it is actually shaped in a way that many people can sit on it. They're sort of forced to look at each other and sit and have a conversation. The second element to this, in terms of making it a sustainable place, is social sustainability. People are talking to each other, and some of the things that they're talking about are the culture of the city. The culture in terms of this small project is we've left these blank spaces that can be designed and these beautiful mosaics applied to the benches by local artisans. So everybody has a personal connection to it immediately. It's not us from Norway coming in and putting something in your city. We're actually just giving something to them that they can start to inhabit and make their own. And it happens at the scale of the hand. This, in coordination with thinking about the larger city in a dreamlike manner, allows those scales to interact and come together. Ultimately, we do deal with buildings primarily. So our buildings, more often than not, have a great deal to do with the landscape. This goes back to our ideals in climbing Snohetta every year. We're interested in bringing the people back to the landscape and vice versa, the landscape in the city. So I asked myself the question, how are our buildings doing? How's our landscape helping? Currently, we've signed up with a coalition of the Nordic nations called Nordic Built. It's a community that comes together to put ideals on the table and sign a document saying that we will stick to these ideals and promote them where possible. Some of the major ones were to make a place that promotes a place for the people that promotes the quality of life. Well, that was very easy for us to sign up with. Something that merges urban living with qualities of nature. In all of the Scandinavian countries and Nordic countries, this is a primary concern for the people. You live in a city, but everybody knows that they work there all the time, and the grind is just getting them down. They need to get away. In Oslo, you can actually take the subway straight up into the forest, into Nordmarka, the northern forest. And on Sunday, it's great. You go up there, and all the people are there, grandmothers and children just walking around the forest. I was a little bit confused, like, what's going on here? What are they doing? But it's just that love of nature that they're interested in maintaining. The third major one that sort of jumped out at me when we were signing this was the utilization of local resources and adaptation to local conditions. This is paramount in the construction industry. You have to go to a place, you have to understand their capabilities of building, you have to talk to them about what materials they can resource from a very close location, and what you can do to help better their environment. Without understanding their local environment and local conditions, you're just making a guess. So you have to interact with everybody here. You have to come give a talk. You have to be the only person not from Mexico here and interact with the culture. We can do this. These are all great ideals that architects and engineers can put down on paper and push forward. But sometimes we need a little help from the government. The government in Norway has started this initiative. So developers, called GLIMP, developers have to take an assessment for their projects, an environmental impact assessment, determine a cost associated with that, and put in a deposit to the government. Then they have to track everything that they do to develop their project. At the end of the day, if the project scores on their level of their expectations, they'll get that deposit back plus some cash incentive. If they don't, then they lose that deposit. So it's a larger incentive for them to push things environmentally, but also is backed by a larger entity that allows more credibility to the development. So it's interesting. The next project that we're working on is maybe a little bit forward thinking, and hopefully we can make this happen as soon as possible. Right now there's a lot of studies in net zero buildings. So through construction all the way to the operations of the building, and 5 years down the line, you determine whether or not your building is healthy and is using more energy than you put into it, and you do all these calculations. Well, we thought, we're putting all of these things in the world, these buildings, these landscape projects, why don't we make something that actually gives something back? So we're trying to build the first energy positive building. Taking into account the construction, the building process, and all of the materials that go into it, our goal is to actually produce energy for the city. It's a commercial building, which is one of the most difficult buildings to make, quote, sustainable or energy zero energy, or even energy positive. We return to some of the earlier principles of like a courtyard that allows light to come in and air to flow through, utilizing some of our passive systems. But what becomes really important is the facade and what the facade can do for us. This is actually a series of solar panels that will power the building and the surrounding buildings for this complex. We have to think about the facade first. It's our skin that is in the environment. It's our mediation between the inside and outside world. And we have to take advantage of everything it has to offer. If we don't, then the facade begins to be designed by the people inside of it. It becomes more of a reaction. They need cooling, so let's just throw a cooling thing outside. Aesthetically, we lose a lot when this happens. So the facade being a concern, we want to make sure that it's aesthetically pleasing, and this is why it occurred to me that maybe people don't think of us as like sustainable architects, because we're always pushing the aesthetic. without losing the idea that buildings need to give back, buildings need to be sustainable, they need to be healthy. So this next one really deals directly with the facade. Again, we're in the middle of the desert. We've wrapped the building in a series of stainless steel tubes. The stainless steel tubes do two things. One, they mitigate the harsh light by keeping it out, or they bend in such a way just to allow light in at certain points that you need it. These tubes are also filled with a saline, are meant to be filled with a saline solution that is pumped through a ground pump. So it's cooled by the groundwater and then pumped around the exterior of the building, cooling the entire building. The water already exists on site. It gets cooled by the earth. So the small amount of energy that we need to actually run the pump can be brought in through solar means. Ultimately, it doesn't look like a very technologically advanced way of doing things. It just looks like a nice, expensive building. But it's not necessarily expensive, especially in the operations. The reason that we need to pay attention to this is because our industry is responsible for the biggest amount of emissions, waste products, and use of resources global-wide. We're above transport, we're above industry. Our CO2 emissions are just off the charts. And it's more or less because of our calculations. When the architect starts his work, he thinks about his job and what he has to do. How much am I putting into it as I draw the building that I design? And then as soon as it's given over to the owner, he's done. So if he's done everything in a sustainable way, he considers that project a sustainable project. This doesn't take into consideration where the materials came from, how far they came from, where they were sourced, the impact on the environment for the city, the social impact of acquiring these materials, the economic impact. All of these should be taken into consideration. Ultimately, it comes down to fuel and our CO2 emissions that affects the earth in the most prominent way. By 2030, we need to get this under wraps. It's about the only amount of time that we have to wean ourselves off of some of the fuel efficiencies that, or the fuels that we're using now, and look for alternative ways of doing things. And again, this is not only about gasoline, it's about the materials, where you source them, how far they come from, and thinking holistically about the types of places that you're making. This isn't new to us. We won our competition in 1989 in Alexandria, Egypt. One of the prominent, the library in Alexandria, Egypt. One of the prominent features of the building is this enormous stone wall. Everyone looks at this stone wall and just falls in love with it immediately. For us, we never really thought that it was, of course we were going to make it the best looking thing possible, but we never thought that it would gain more in terms of sustainability than just its aesthetic. When we started to design, we found out that the quarry that supplied all of this stonework to Alexandria had recently shut down. The industry had shifted to all of this metal making and glass and etc. And they had this enormous resource right at hand that was only a few blocks down the street, more or less. So let's just use that. And we reopened the quarry. We brought jobs back to the city that had already existed. Not only did we do that, but it was so close that we could just bring the stone over to the site very easily with a minimal amount of fuel. I mean, we were architects in Norway and thinking, well, let's just use the stuff here. We're not going to bring all of our expert materials from Europe. Let's just utilize what the people have. It turned out being great because they knew how to work with the stone already. So there was no training involved. There was no extra time involved. It was just a natural way of doing things. The point about that is you're looking at the local climate, you're looking at the local expertise, you're looking at the local economics and making a decision that is based on more than just, wow, that looks amazing, let's build it. So in almost the opposite fashion, when we were working on the Norwegian embassy in Berlin, we decided that we would want a little bit of Norway to be part of the embassy. We started to look at our studies and decided that the best way to do that in terms of cost and transportation was to actually physically take a little piece of Norway. Turns out this was left a smaller CO2 footprint and cost less than hiring somebody to go to the quarry, cut each individual stone, truck it to the site, and then put it in place. We just had one move, one big cut, one small transportation, and then we set the facade in place. Time-wise, it even shortened the building in time. So again, it's knowing the economics of the place. In the Opera House in Oslo, we were faced with a very tough challenge. We were given a site that was previously the industrial fjord, and just in a basic and simple way, what we wanted to do was have people touch the water once again. Most cities have this enormous seawall that's 12 feet tall, and nobody actually gets to interact with the water. Nobody gets to touch it. It's such a tough thing as a city inhabitant to have something so beautiful that you don't even get to interact with. So we said, all right, let's put the building in the water. Well, this opened up a whole new realm of doing things, especially in this industrial port. We ended up forcing the city to make the water cleanable, make it inhabitable. This eliminated 16 million tons of toxins from this industrial port. And unknowing, we reintroduced some of the animals that were actually there. The fish have come back, the swans have come back, the people have come back. I think primarily we were interested in the aesthetic and the idea that people could come to the water, but the impacts that we had overall were tremendous. Far more reaching than what we could have imagined. If you don't know the building, many of the people that come to the building don't actually go to the opera. They just come and inhabit the top of the building. So it provided a place, again, a social place for them to return to. Thinking a little bit about materials and having a minimal impact. This actually is a little project that we did. It's a tourist route in Norway. And the idea here is that we have a very small visual impact on the landscape. The landscape is such an amazing and beautiful thing that whatever we did on this landscape, we thought it's going to ruin it. Let's just let it be what it is. So this tourist route is actually to see, or this point on the tourist route is to see an old castle. So the thing you saw here is the castle that already exists. That's the point in the landscape that somebody built before. And we slip in actually underneath. So we're minimizing the visual landscape, minimizing the impact. We're not asking people to come here and build other things around this. Let's keep it pure. Just by minimizing that visual impact, people are understanding that, oh, we're not going to develop here. We're not going to, this is a place of beauty, a place of nature that we're going to have to maintain. We took into account the materials, the local materials. All the wood was collected from a nearby beach, and it was milled driftwood. And then all of the caisson stones were just collected, field stones collected from the site and put into caissons. Very minimal project that had a large impact. And because it's on a tourist route, many people are able to experience this. It's not rocket science here. We're not doing the most prolific engineering or trying to go to the moon. I mean, a lot of this stuff we already know. And a lot of us have experiences in our own personal lives that start to drive these ideas. I grew up in Colorado, in the state of Colorado in the U.S. And one of the most fascinating buildings that I've always loved was taking place in the western Colorado and the plains stretching western and eastern Colorado stretching east. The Plains Indians had such a beautiful building, the teepee. It's not a permanent building. It's not a building that everybody thinks is an icon. But in terms of sustainability, it was one of the smartest buildings I ever knew. What we understand from them was that they had a limited number of resources, and they did with those resources everything that they could, from the design of the household to the transportation of it. They actually used the poles to drag all of their materials from site to site. They used natural materials that was from their hunting process, and if they needed to be renewed, They just hunted more. They were even smart about the mechanical systems. They built a fire in the middle and they made a hole. They made a hole out of the top. So you draw the air in and the smoke goes out. You can control that with these flaps on the top. This is a fully self-sustaining building. And the reason that it's self-sustaining is because they didn't think that they had more resources than were actually allocated for building their homes. They weren't out there trying to mine steel and stones and build something more permanent. They just understood, let's have the lowest impact, let's be mobile, and let's just use what we have at hand. This is actually the mind frame that we need right now, because although we think we have unlimited resources and we can build everything that's possible out there, we're actually running out of our resources. We need to be smarter about the things that we use. I've seen today here in the expo some examples of that, where people are demolishing buildings and crushing up the materials and using them in other building processes. That's the kind of smart thinking that we need to start to work on, reappropriate different materials and buildings for different uses. They even found a way in the end to make their place wherever they wanted. And some people love this, so they somehow incorporate in some modern ideals as well, which is kind of fun. The point about this is, again, they were looking at their local place, what their local place had to offer, what their economics had to offer, transportability, light, mechanical systems, airflow. They're taking into account everything everybody in this room is working with day in and day out. We're working on a project here, it's quite local, the Museum de Ciencias Ambientales for the University of Guadalajara. And initially we won the competition, we were invited to participate. We did the best we could with our short amount of time to research the area, to understand the culture, the people. But ultimately we won, lucky enough, and then the university put together a trip. Fortunate for us, the content of the museum is to showcase all of the environments that are in your state, the state of Jalisco. The trip took us everywhere. I mean, you can see from the map, we were all over the state of Jalisco. We got to interact with the people, the everyday people, look at a lot of the materials that come from the place, both historically, what's being used now. We got to be immersed in the culture. Most of you know these places, and if not, you should try to visit if you can. We were everywhere from the beaches in Puerto Vallarta all the way to the top of Volcan Colima. It was really important for us to be immersed in that culture, immersed in the landscape, to understand what this place is about, how people move around, how people interact with the environment that they're building themselves, both from the environmental standpoint and from the city standpoint. Ultimately, these environments are going to be housed within the museum. And we began to understand that there's an important connection to the landscape in this project, to the areas that we visited. That became a larger understanding of how we would organize the site. So the large green swath that you see coming through are various gardens that are pulled from the state of Jalisco. They actually pass through the center of the building. We open up the building to the people. We allow the people to come into the middle of the building, and they never even have to enter it. So on the south side, you see the main entry to the building is just open and inviting. You never have to go inside the building to understand anything about science or the environments. You just have to walk through and enjoy the sunlight coming down, or the bit of shade as you pass by one of the pools. Opening this up allowed us to create these gardens where you enter and have a connection to the greater cultural campus on either side. So by opening ourselves up, we kind of stepped back in history and started to look also at the vernacular of local buildings. The courtyard building is such a smart and sustainable way of doing things. It brings light in, it allows air to flow through, it gives people at the center of the building a connection to the landscape and to the environment. Our building's a little bit larger, so we have multiple courtyards, and ultimately this path that connects through. But it was understanding that this local way of doing things probably had a lot to offer in terms of the environment. So ultimately we have this interior courtyard, and eventually everybody will go in the building and start to experience some of the sustainable ideals that come along with it. These are preliminary sketches, but they actually have a lot of content in them. They're really some strong ideas here. Water collection is going to be paramount in this city. There's already, I'm sure most of you have experienced a water shortage. Lake Chapala is going down. So whatever efforts we can do to collect water, retain it, reuse it on site. Solar shading is another one that we need to make sure that we're decreasing the amount of energy that the buildings use, so we need to shade it all the right ways. Air circulation in passive systems is very important. It's such a very simple principle that even the TP was able to teach us. There's a bigger opening and a smaller opening, and air likes to flow through. Very simple idea for passive systems. Some solar collections as well. To cool the building, we're again looking at the earth and the possibility of doing a submersive tunnel that actually collects air, cools the air as it passes underneath the ground, and then is released into the building. Even our structural system, we could have gone crazy with cantilevers, as architects love to do. We could have just made it as zoomy and quick and fast as possible. But there's no sense in that. There's a great amount of concrete work that's being done here. People understand this material, and to use it in such a simple way was just appealing to us. We knew it could be built easily, less expensive, and then there are a few small places where we'll introduce a little bit of steel to add to some of the aesthetic and physicality of this. Ultimately, if you do enter this building and partake in all of the environmental sciences research and exhibits that it has to offer, you'll make your way to the roof of the building, and the roof gives you a point of reflection, a point where you can take into account everything that you've learned within the building and look out on your city, look out on Guadalajara and understand your impact on the city, your impact in your everyday life, in your work life, in your life that is both inside the city and outside the city, and really look at things holistically. How do we make this a good place for the people that live here and bring other people to this place, this very beautiful place that we need to hang on to. That's, I guess, where I leave off. And for me, this is definitely more of a discussion. So I want to take any questions that you guys have. We have a translator too. So thank you.
Microphone just to tell them that we have 3 questions because of the time.
Oh, okay.
Jim, ¿me lo pasas tantito? Can I have the microphone just a bit?
Bueno, a continuación tenemos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas y por cuestiones de tiempo solamente responderemos 3. Así que, por favor.
Some libraries. One of them was not in one of the cultural center. I had the great opportunity to visit the Alexandria Library.
Ooh, lucky you.
So thank you, because it has been an icon worldwide, and it's an example of how a good sustainable library has to be. I have several questions. First, what do you think about green roofs in different buildings, librarian museums, houses in the world? I've seen some of them in Chicago at the Oak Park Library as a green roof, and it's working. So that, the benefits of that. The other thing, within all your experience, how, in working in different countries, what would you suggest to educate people? I know that one of the purposes of the museum and the cultural center is to educate people on sustainable buildings and environment. But what would you recommend for emerging countries that are not that conscious of the benefits of the sustainable buildings? What kind of approach would you suggest for they can And the other thing, does your firm work for the lead recognition like the Seattle Public Library, where they use the light, the water, and they use very low energy?
Right.
Those things.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm getting that back.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what was the first one? Okay, I'll try and be brief. I guess we're running out a little bit of time. We do work on LEED projects. All of our projects are LEED certified. It is a means, a governmental means to keep things in check, and I think it's a smart way of doing things. We often don't promote that because it's just our way of doing things. So yes, we're LEED certified in all of our buildings. As you can see, some of the examples here. In terms of emerging cultures and educating them on sustainability, sustainability is an old way of doing things. You have to think of it as passive systems, ways of reducing our energy use. And these emerging countries actually are already very sustainable in what they're doing. They're part of the 50% that aren't in cities right now that are utilizing their minimal resources to do the minimal thing that they need to. They're doing it by necessity and not by choice. So it's tough. You have to educate people so that they become smarter, but as they become smarter, they want more things. And when you want more things, it requires more resources. So it's kind of difficult to find a way, it's challenging to find a way to educate them in the right way. And by and far, the right way is just to take a look at your own situation, look at your own place, and take the best qualities of it. I mean, it'll even work with the internet if you start to look at what the best qualities of that are. And then your third question is for green roofs. Again, it's a very natural way of doing things in many parts of the world. There's a local resource that you have right there that you would normally throw away. It can't be applied worldwide in the same way that you think it may be existing in Chicago or in Norway. You have to have a particular environment that allows for this. The benefits are immense. We're looking at partially the roof for the museum to be a green roof. We're going to grow agave. That makes sense. You can grow agave here. What we get from that is a large amount of insulation on top of the roof that helps with our cooling qualities. And maybe the restaurant can use the agave.
Thank you. About the research, this group of Norwegian companies are making, is it available for our products? I mean, is it published or can we get to it web?
Hello? Yes, it's open to the rest of the globe. It's just a bunch of Norwegian companies that have come together in their close proximity to develop the ideals here. But it's open global-wide. The one that I spoke most about is called Nordic Build. But the principles are happening. It actually makes more sense to develop something like that in your own city because your criteria might be slightly different. And the economics have a big deal to do that with that, especially if you're utilizing the government to help you understand the impacts. But it's a brilliant idea, and it's just a challenge to everybody else to do this and really stick to it. It's your peers, it's your peer review that really makes sure that we're going forward in the right direction. Anyone else?
How long is the term that you're expecting for development of the sale of CCS in terms of preparing the native and endemic plants? Agave is a fashion nowadays, but there are plenty of plants using, but we need time to prepare them. To notice some negatives, negatives, progress. The term of the time is not necessary to understand in order to be ready for this successful.
This is one of the most beautiful parts about the landscape, is that there's this different timeline that it exists. When we build buildings, we can do a drawing and we can think of it as a permanent thing that we put up in 8, 10 years, depending on the size of the building, and it will be that. But when we draw the landscape, especially with all these computer programs and renderings we have, we always draw the most lush and beautiful landscape. And that actually takes 10, 15 years down the line for it to become as cultivated as possible. So I think there's ways of introducing things into the museum earlier on that will grow with the museum. And actually some of the architectural details will help complement some of that. In terms of the calendar schedule, I mean, it's anybody's guess on that. We have to go through the process of actually identifying those species that are going to be part of the narrative of the museum. And the sooner that we identify them, the more cultivated they can be. But that may not necessarily be what we want, a fully cultivated greenscape on day one. We may want the process of that growth of that particular plant to be part of the education. Where does the agave come from? How does it grow? How is it harvested? Where does it go afterward? So it'll be an interesting discourse over the next couple of years as we get into the design and the conversations with everyone about how to do this. Well, I think that's the last question. We're out of time. I appreciate everyone coming today, and thank you for inviting me once again. Enjoy everything that's out there.
Un pequeño obsequio al arquitecto Jan de Despacho Snohetta. Gracias, Jan, por acompañarnos. Creo que nos quedamos muy contentos de tu visita y realmente veo las caras que Jalisco y Guadalajara, la Cámara de la Construcción, ya te queremos ya. Bienvenido y que esta es tu casa.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.